Hello, my name is Andrew. In this video, you're going to see me cook through a bunch of mushrooms. This is part of an ongoing series where I make a lot of recipes featuring one ingredient in an effort to better understand how that ingredient works. I'm usually making things I've never made before, often not getting it exactly right, but there's something about the repetition that is very fun playing with the same ingredient over and over again that can show you a lot about what makes it great. Mushrooms are very cool. First of all, they look awesome. They often grow in mysterious circumstances, and they often possess flavors that you really can't get from anything else. So I've already cooked through all of these recipes, and now I'm gonna take you through how those experiences went. The first thing I made was Duxelles, which is sort of a mushroom spread that can be used as an ingredient in itself. I began by cleaning my mushrooms, and I wanted to use button mushrooms, or these baby Bella mushrooms, and I thought that this technique would be a great way of maximizing the flavor and extending the life of this simplest mushroom. I ended up using about 3 pounds of them, because making any amount of Duxelles I think is gonna be fairly time consuming, and increasing the scale doesn't change that overall time too much. So I chopped them down to sort of the finest mince that I could. So I began by sweating some minced shallot, adding some garlic, and then all of my mushrooms. I actually had so much mushroom that I began cooking a portion of it and then went back to chopping more. And then as the moisture reduced out of those mushrooms, I would just add more to the pan and continuously stir it and wilt it down further. Once it dries out, it begins to sort of toast and almost caramelize a little bit, which is going to increase the flavor of those mushrooms a lot. And then I just checked it for seasoning, added a little bit of thyme, wine, and that was essentially done. The first thing I made though is a little canapé, like a little snack with some of the fresh Duxelles that was simply a thin piece of bread, a little bit of goat cheese on top, a mound of that Duxelles, and a little bit of chives on that. And this was really good. For me, I associate this taste with like Thanksgiving stuffing, which in mine I add a lot of mushroom. And so it's like that flavor as a little treat. Most of the Duxelles I ended up putting into an ice cube tray so that it could be portioned and kept long term to then be added to dishes later on. So for example, I made a very simple pasta. I began by cutting up a small amount of fresh shiitake mushroom, although I think you could use any or none in this application. I cooked that mushroom in a little bit of olive oil, and then I took a cube of that frozen Duxelles and melted it with some of my pasta cooking liquid to create the base of this very quick sauce. This is sort of based on real dishes I've seen, but ultimately really just made up by me, utilizing the basic technique of creating a sauce out of the starchy cooking liquid and agitating that with cheese and the mushrooms to create a creamy sauce for the noodle. And the taste is incredible. It's just multiplying that mushroom umami flavor. It's so good. The next thing I made was Jamur Goreng, Indonesian fried oyster mushroom. And this is actually a dish that was recommended to me on Instagram by a number of people. So if you're one of those people, thank you very much. I referenced a recipe from the chef Davina Hermawan on YouTube. So I started by separating my oyster mushroom. I had this sort of large stalk of mushrooms that I separated by hand into their individual petals, I guess you would say. They're petal shaped, I don't know what else to call it. And then I took these and salted them to extract some of their moisture and get some of that seasoning inside. And then I rinsed them and squeezed out as much moisture as possible. In the recipe, I was surprised by this step because I assumed that if I applied this much force to a mushroom, I would just crush it and disintegrate it into nothing. But this really exposed just how much structural integrity an oyster mushroom has, and they held up very well. I then assembled my dry and wet batters. The wet had some minced garlic and shallot. It was then simply a matter of battering wet into dry and then frying in a shallow pot of hot oil. And all of the normal deep frying rules apply here. You could double fry them to make them extra crispy. Mine took about 1 flip to come out very golden and delicious looking. The oyster mushroom shape is just perfectly conducive to getting a great fried thing out of it. It has that aspect ratio of being kind of wide but flat, and all of the pieces of mushroom have that same basic shape, so they all fry in the same way. It can get so crispy, but the inside can basically never overcook, and you end up with this perfect tender fillet of mushroom, so to speak. I ate them with the recommended chili sauce, and they were pretty awesome. like very delicious. I honestly think that this is the best thing to be fried that I've ever fried. The next thing I made was porcini risotto. And I referenced a recipe from Massimo Bottura published by Masterclass. So this preparation of risotto intrigued me because it utilized exclusively dried porcini mushrooms. And the recipe specifies that you could add fresh mushrooms if you wish, but that ultimately they were not a substitute or a replacement for dried ones because there's so much more flavor that can be extracted from a dried mushroom when it's rehydrated. So my porcini were pretty clean, so I rehydrated them directly in the stock that I was going to use to make the risotto. I then prepared my other ingredients, minced some shallot. In a pan with some melted butter, I began sweating that shallot, then added some minced garlic, and then I added the rice. I'm using carnaroli rice, which is one of the recommended rices for risotto because of its starch content, and the way it releases that starch can make for a very creamy final risotto. So that rice gets toasted in the pan for a number of minutes, which is also going to reveal some natural nutty flavors of the rice. And then when the outside of each grain is becoming translucent, I splash in some white wine and some of the broth. And you can see now how much darker that stock became once it was fortified with those porcini mushrooms. And at this point, it really just tasted like a mushroom stock. In 1 ladle increments, I'm adding broth to the rice, allowing it to cook and soak into the grains, and then adding more broth step by step. And I think this is done so that it can release its starch in a particular way. At the point that it becomes al dente, it also has the final creamy mushroom sauce in with everything. When it was close to being finished, I took my dried porcini, gave them a rough chop, added them to the risotto, and with the heat off, I added butter, cheese, tasted for salt, and then allowed the risotto to sit with the lid on for 5 minutes for the final amount of cooking to be done with the carryover heat. I'm sure there are many, many ways to make a mushroom risotto, but this one really intrigued me because it was so singularly a stock with dried mushrooms and rice. And it was so good. I'm not sure my final consistency was textbook perfect, but the flavor was incredible. Porcinis naturally have a little bit of nuttiness themselves, and with the nuttiness of that toasted rice, I thought it created this beautiful symmetry. Cheese is always good on everything, but this is one of those dishes where the Parmesan really just completes this triangle of flavor where suddenly it's like, oh my God, this is risotto. The next thing I made was a Morel cream sauce. And I referenced a recipe from Alan Burgo and his website, Forager Chef. To start, I took some butter in my heavy Dutch oven and slowly browned the skin of my chicken, doing it at a relatively low temperature so as not to burn the butter, as this would be the basis for the sauce to come next. In the meantime, I cleaned my morels. The morel mushroom is this unique and highly coveted mushroom that tends to come up around springtime, which is why I'm doing this video at this time of year. And I got my morels from a local farmer's market and this vendor called LA Fungi. Some of mine are larger, some are smaller, and I tried to cut them into approximately the same size pieces. And you end up with what looked to me like little Lego tires of mushroom. When my chicken was adequately browned on either side, I removed it and then took some sliced shallot and began melting that in my pot with more butter. When the shallot had softened, I added my morels and then eventually deglazed with wine and sherry. When all the wine had reduced, I added some demi-glace, which thankfully I had some in my freezer from a previous video, and then also some cream. I allowed that to reduce until it was nice and thick, and then I opted to return the chicken to the pot so that it could finish together with the sauce. Foraged morels are so prized because, like any wild mushroom, they're going to take on the flavor of the environment that they grow in. So their flavor is described as very woodsy and earthy. They're mushroomy, but it's a bit more specific. It's like trying to describe how different parts of a single forest smell. And while the sauce ended up being a pretty standard pan sauce type of formulation, I think this is good with morels because it sticks with that recommendation of less is more. It's super tasty, a creamy, delicious sauce. The wine adds some sweetness and acidity, and yeah, this is a sauce that'll have you licking the plate when the cameras are off. The last thing I made was a mushroom toast. And when I started thinking about it, the thing I really wanted to do was attempt recreating the toast that I had while filming Worth It at Petite Crème in San Francisco. It was an unforgettable experience speaking with Dominique Crenn about how she makes this toast, And I basically followed the steps that I learned in that video in making this toast. So I began with my mushrooms. I had a few other varieties that I got from the same place that I got the Morels. And these were a golden oyster, something called a cauliflower mushroom, and a little bit of porcini. And I started by breaking these apart into roughly equal sizes that would cook well together. And in a pan with plenty of butter, I began frying those mushrooms. So at Petit Crème, the toast had an Espelette mayonnaise, so I decided to also make my own mayo. In a blender with eggs, etc., etc., etc. I whizzed that together, and then I added some chili pepper along with a couple of other things until I thought it tasted nice. When I saw my mushrooms were getting nice and golden, I began seasoning them, and I also had some wild green onion. This is just one of the cool things that happens at a farmer's market. I was picking out all these wild mushrooms, and they said, hey, we also have this green onion. It seems like something that would go with what you're cooking. Here you go. So then it was time to assemble the toast. And I was trying to replicate as close as possible what I had at Petit Crème. So first there was the mayonnaise, then some minced chives, then a base layer of my mushrooms. Then I had some thin slices of pickle that I arranged over that, more mushrooms on top of that. At Petit Crème, they had some elephant garlic chips. I couldn't find elephant garlic, but I decided to make some garlic chips anyway. With a little creative liberty, I took the flowers that were on that wild green onion, which I had previously plucked off, and arranged those along the top of the toast as well. Finally, some flaky sea salt. I mean, the whole thing with a toast is that when you have something delicious like these wild forage mushrooms that don't need much done to them, just eat them on toast. And I think this is really the lesson from mushrooms in general, which is that they are this miracle of nature. They spring up in the dark, damp crevices of the forest. They're super delicious because they are the product of their environments. And really, you shouldn't have to do much for them when they are properly sourced and really delicious. Well, that's how I cooked through 5 pounds of mushrooms. For everyone who gave me a mushroom recommendation, thank you so much. But if you have another recommendation for what I should cook next or in the future, please, I'd love to hear it in the comments. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching.